All right, everyone. Thank you so much. To honor your time and the time of each of one of us, we'd like to welcome you all tonight to our first Transition Talks of the year. And we're very grateful that you're here tonight. My name is Ann Phelan, and I'm the Manager of Resources and Engagement at the Perkins Transition Center. We're very grateful that you're here tonight. We have new members in our participating audience, which we're grateful to have you and we welcome you. And we also have returning guests. So we're very grateful for you coming together with us tonight. When we build a community and engage together, it's very empowering. And we support each other when we do come together. Our transition talks touch on topics that we believe are challenging in areas where people need information to understand what to do after high school and the next step. And we also know that the transition process is ongoing for weeks and months and sometimes years. And tonight we'll be talking about that. What to do to create a sustainable life when you're not able to be present in the life of your adult child, but also how to be more aware of ways that you can streamline that process and be prepared. I would like to let you know that tonight's recording will be recorded and you will get information as a follow-up email from Janine Brennan, who is with us tonight. She is the Manager of Communication and Content. And we also have other members of our transition team here. We work for the Perkins School for the Blind. The Transition Center supports all disabilities, and we welcome you all. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. By the way, we have a Q&A in the chat. So if you have any questions along the way, we might interrupt Dr. Clawson and answer some of your questions, and we might wait till the end, but your questions will be answered. Also, if there are any links or information that we want to share, the Director of Transition Program, Alexandra Lavoie, will be here serving that support tonight. So without further ado, Dr. Lance Clawson, I welcome you. We've worked together before. I just want to give a brief little bio. You're a psychiatrist with great expertise in behavioral health, working with people on the autism spectrum, psychopharmacological interventions, and also a dad of a young woman with a disability. So Lance, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I guess our next slide will be my smiling face. There we go. 10 years ago. So thank you very much, Ann. Thank you very much to Perkins Transition Center for having me. And when Ann and I were first talking about this, we were kind of thinking, well, if I was going to talk about something, what would that be? And particularly around the idea of transitions. And it was really the thing that kind of jumps into my mind that's been most relevant in both my personal and professional life as I continue to revisit the idea of a life plan for for my patients as well as for my daughter, that I deal with this on a regular basis and see it from a number of different points of view. In fact, the title, if you could go to the next slide, is creating a sustainable life plan for your disabled child or family member. But we're talking about a number of different considerations, some of them legal, and I'm not a lawyer, I'll let you know that. Some of them financial. I'm not a financial expert either, but I've been through these things many times. So I've kind of developed a sense of what to look for, but a lot of them are emotional. And that definitely falls into my my bailiwick as a psychiatrist. And so the next slide, it's so kind of who am I? I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I've been doing this for 40 years. And for kind of lack of a better reason, why do they say, why are you an expert in developmental disabilities and rare genetic disorders and autism and all that stuff? And I was like, well, it's very simple. I was actually a specialist in medically ill children. And then my daughter was born with developmental disabilities. And in just caring for her, all of a sudden I knew things that the other psychiatrists didn't seem to have a handle on. So people started lining up outside the door because I just kind of understood it from the educational standpoint, from the community support standpoint, as well as kind of the medical and the psychiatric standpoint. And so my daughter's a gem. You can see her in the middle of us there. This is at the where is this? This is at the Tibetan Buddhist monastery in just outside of Woodstock, New York, where we just spent a month where my daughter was doing an arts residency. She's an artist. And so she got invited to be a professional artist at the Birdcliff Guild. And so, of course, she can't go by herself. So we went too. Next slide. So why am I even giving the talk? And this is kind of what I was touching on earlier. All as parents, we all try and do our best job. Okay, we work hard to consider, what's in the best interest of my child, what are their long-term needs. Um, but it's very hard to know what you don't know. It's very hard to wrap our heads around things that where we haven't experienced it. Because a lot of times when we're talking about an individual with special needs and their family members, we're trying to envision what the future is going to be. And that isn't so easy if you haven't lived it. And our own points of view change as we evolve and we hit different points in our life and what's relevant and what's important to us. So it's really not a criticism to families. Why don't they do it always realistically or effectively? It's just more of a reflection on how hard it is to do this. And it's also not so easy to talk about, well, what's going to happen when I'm not here anymore? Okay. It's hard for us to spend time on that and think it through. And it can be overwhelming, not just because of the emotional aspect, but there are a lot of unknown details. And so creating a sustainable plan has both very realistic elements and it has kind of just emotional elements and thinking about that. I had a mom call me the other day and she said, "Can you put me on medication? I cannot tolerate the idea of my daughter being in the world without me." And I was like, so she's right in the middle of it. She hasn't been able to filter it out. It's really getting her. So for many families, the basic plan is based on the parent, us always being here. And I have many, many patients in the past, hundreds and hundreds, who everybody's happy because the child is living at home and it seems to be in a good balance. And that's fantastic, except that's not realistic because that's most children will outlive their parents. And so, or they will outlive their parents' effective ability to care for them. So, is it wrong that families kind of don't think of that next phase? No, it's just part of how we kind of evolve and wrap our heads around these things. We get better and better at it when we're forced to. But my position is it's actually good to kind of really think it through prior to being forced to, because I've had some, undesirable outcomes of all of a sudden an adult patient being left without family members on short notice, like, overnight, that type of thing. So we don't want that. We want to kind of think of what's in their best interest, what can we do, but also, how to continue their best life, that which we've set up for them. So why don't you change slides? So as I think about my own retirement, I'm thinking a lot more about what needs to be in place if my wife and I are no longer here to assist in our daughter's care. And it was a great example because we were up in Woodstock and she did great, but wouldn't have happened without us. Okay. Which is kind of nice. It's okay with me. I don't mind going on artist residencies for a month and living in other places, but it still means she requires a certain level of support. So estate planning and potential future problems, we've generally kind of thought those through, and we've been doing that for a long time. Ever since my wife finished law school, we've been thinking about this because all of a sudden she kind of understood, the law and all of this thing, all these things. But as we've re-looked at our plan, it's kind of funny how kind of naive we were 10 and 20 years ago when we were really digging into this. So as our children change and mature, and in some cases fail to mature, our calculus about what will be needed has to adapt and change along with the evolving picture of who our child is and kind of what our ability is to support them. So when I'm saying sustainable, I'm saying what is really practical, realistic, feasible, and actionable that we can put in place that we can ensure is going to happen when we're not here. And that's a lot of ways to skin the cat. There are a lot, I've have people with all different means, okay, financial means and family means, and there are a lot of different ways you can do this. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about? It's the the age-old question, who's going to take care of my child when I'm not here? And it really bothers some folks, and other folks, it doesn't bother them at all. In fact, I'm kind of asking them, can you please think about this? And they kind of look at me and stare at me and then kind of change the subject. So for some people, it's harder to think about than others. Some people, it's almost too easy to think about. But it's kind of how do we project into the future what our child might need in 10, 20, 30 years. And so we can't come up with all the answers, but we do have to think about it. So that's the challenge. Next slide. So I kind of thought about, well, what are the key elements of a sustainable long-term plan? And so this is kind of how I've broken it down, and I'm sure there are other ways to think about it. But the first thing is what is our child or family member's best life? Okay. What are they like? What life could they be living that gives them purpose, that gives them a sense of belonging, gives them a sense of community, gives them a sense of caring and love? And that can look a lot of different ways, but that's a really important thing to be thinking about. And that's something that we have to be able to adapt as our particularly our adult children get older. My daughter at 32 is very different than she was at 22. And so what I think about for her is very different. Also, what's their level of functional independence now and what's projected to be in the future? This is really important because all your supports flow from what they can do for themselves versus what must be done by others. That's just the simple calculation. And we'll talk about how we might kind of consider that. The other piece is family estate planning. If you don't have a will and you don't have a number of different elements in place and you haven't worked with attorneys, the whole thing can really go belly up if you disappear quickly. Okay. On short notice, as I'll say, simply because there are a lot of specialized legal types of things that need to be done to ensure our child's needs are met, that their entitlements continue, because the next element is what are the state and federal entitlements that our child's eligible for. And then finally, okay, who takes our place? Who are the overseers? Who are the trustees? Who are the managers? What's this whole thing? And I'll talk about supported decision making. So these are the elements that we have to kind of think through, and they all interact. Okay. One drives another. But we have to kind of go through them and then kind of see how do we coordinate them. So next slide. So first is what's their best life? Okay. So what's the disability type? That's very important to know. Is it intellectual learning? Do they have executive functioning problems, visual problems, other sensory problems, hearing, autism, intellectual disability? And you have to think about that in a lot of different ways. I do these kind of standardized functional assessment or independent living assessments for a number of my patients. And I have to be sure to reiterate, this is if your child woke up in their own apartment, didn't call anybody, had no one there to help them, and what could they do without anybody there? Because a lot of what we get used to as parents is, of course they can do that. Well, they can do that because you reminded them, or they did that because you laid out their clothes the night before, or any other number of things. Or they could, take a shower and use soap because you replaced the soap. Okay. So these are all really, really, really important things to kind of know about, because that has to be really kind of looked at in a fairly fine, granular way, particularly as you're planning for the future. And if your child wasn't living at home with you, what could they really do for themselves is what I was saying. And can they address novel problems? I have a number of people that I work with that they're pretty dialed in. And a lot of them have like mild intellectual disability, don't have a high school diploma, et cetera, et cetera. They've got a job, they're driving, I've, done all these accommodations. They're doing great. They're living in their own apartment and everything. And it's all great until something unexpected happens. And then it's not. Okay. So these are other things, how do they do with novel problem solving? Can they seek out others to help them solve problems, et cetera? Can they do that independently? If not, then they need a bit of care and oversight. And then also, what do they want to do? What are their interests? Do they have passions? What we know in looking at the research, if your special needs family member doesn't have something to keep them engaged, they're not living their best life. No matter what your level of functioning, if there isn't some kind of daily engagement, then there's depression, there's behavioral issues, there's all kinds of stuff that happens over time. And this has been shown even for, say, people who have, kind of moderate to severe intellectual disabilities and autism and all kinds of issues. If you don't have a way for them to be engaged and part of something and participatory, then it's not going to go well. So you want to kind of think about what can they do as an adult? What I call it is developing ikigai. That's what the Okinawans call, purpose. We all have to have purpose. We all have to have a reason to get up in the morning. And that is probably one of the more important things you can kind of think about in terms of what your, family member's best life is going to be or might be. Next slide, please. Also, what are the social goals? Do they have any? Okay. I have a number of patients who have no social goals and they're pretty happy being pretty isolated. The problem then is if they're only, like, just for instance, adult autistics who live independently, i.e. an autistic adult who can pretty much take care of themselves with minimal supports, their average number of social contacts is 1 per month. Okay. So that's pretty low. But when their family disappears, then it goes to 0. Okay. And so you have to think, how do we plug that in? How do we structure that? And then how do they perform socially if they do want friends? How much facilitation and support do they need? How can they do in structured versus unstructured situation? Because if they want friends, and even if they don't want friends, human contact is still an important element. There's plenty of research to show that. Doesn't matter whether you have autism or not. You still need some kind of social engagement as well as purpose. And then if they don't do well in free form social stuff, then are there social structured things they enjoy? Can these activities become part of their regular routine? We're talking about building out a picture of what their life could look like. A big one is, what are their romantic wishes? I have many, many developmentally delayed adults who have no friends, who have, occasional contact with their family. And they told me, and the males in particular will say their primary goal is to have a girlfriend. And I kind of say, hold on. Okay, we got some baby steps here first. I think we have to learn how to make friends first. Well, we'll kind of start there. So we kind of have to think, what do they need in place? What skills do they need in place? If this is really a driving desire, we want them to be happiest. And it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to have a romantic partner, but at least try and support them on that path. I have individuals who say, I want to get married and have children. Well, I mean, medically, they may not be able to have children, but they have an intellectual disability. So we don't kind of necessarily crush that, but we do try and support them and help them kind of over time develop kind of an image of what their life's going to be that is, gratifying to them. But that's a huge, issue in its own right, and very prevalent in the 20, particularly in the 20-year-olds, the 20s. Next slide. And then, do their goals and desire fit the reality? Okay. So this is one example I said earlier. It's like, well, if your child wants to have children, but has an intellectual disability, is medically unstable, that's not realistic. So it's very delicate. You often need professional help and therapy to kind of help them with that, because you're going to want them to weigh in on their best life, but you also want to build a realistic best life. Okay. And then, is your child I have one individual who can't speak to anyone outside of their family, yet only wants a romantic relationship with a non-disabled peer. who's absolutely mute in public. And then, so that's a kind of core part of our therapy, because we have to help him kind of either figure out a way to move forward or figure out a way to have a life that's gratifying, that takes into account some of his limitations or disabilities. And then the hardest thing for parents, particularly when we have a disabled child, is it our idea or is it theirs? Okay. Because we're so used to filling in for them, it's automatic. So you always want to think, particularly when your child gets into their 20s, and I would say in particular the mid 20s and beyond, it's they'll start thinking much more independently, even with intellectual disability. And so you want to make sure, how can you align their goals with yours? Does your best life, because that's a negotiation, because you're going to put some real effort behind this if you're doing this long-term planning. And then thinking about these issues helps families plan the richest life for their special needs child. And it's a process. You don't just kind of go in and go off the checklist I just gave you. It's something that you kind of evolve and develop over time. So that's why I said, well, geez, 10 years ago was a very different picture than now. And this part of it, what's the best life moving forward, informs kind of some of the supports that might be put in place, but it also kind of helps you guide the folks that are supporting your child in terms of what their preferred kind of life and lifestyle might be next. So also, what's their level of functional independence now and what's projected in the future? Because that really determines how much support they're going to need. And this is very straightforward. You got to take a formal look at their functional capabilities, because it really helps with planning. And so you have to kind of think, does my child need one-to-one support? Okay. I mean, I have to fill out forms where it says, does this child, does this individual require someone to stay overnight with them and remain awake all night? Because I certainly have individuals I work with that if someone isn't in the house and awake, it could lead to an awful lot of difficulty. But, most of them, they just need someone in the house. They don't need someone awake. So there's something called, just as an example, and remember, I'm giving a lot of examples, but there may be other things that are a better fit for you, your family, and your family member. But this is a real good one. It's kind of the gold standard, called the Supports Intensity Scale. And that's a fairly detailed document that you want everybody to kind of fill out in thinking about your family member, because it really goes into significant detail about how much support is required on a daily basis, how many hours that requires, what the very, very detailed and specific tasks are. And that can really kind of help determine the level of staffing they might need as an adult. And some people I have folks who need 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, around the clock. And I have people who someone checks in with them once a week just to make sure their pills are loaded up and the apartment's clean. Okay. And then also, hopefully you have professionals involved, who can render opinions and help with the assessment. Psychologists often will do an assessment, but there are other individuals who can do functional assessments to kind of say how independent and, where are the gaps and where are the strengths. Just a very important thing to look at in a more formal way, because that's going to let you know, what are we going to need moving forward. Here's a big one. Okay. Guardianship. This gets talked about a lot. Okay. And a lot of families, particularly with intellectual disability, want to take guardianship because that feels more secure. Well, I'll tell you, in reality, it really doesn't make that much difference. Okay. The only time guardianship matters is if your family member is very irascible, maybe has bipolar disorder, and goes off the rails every once in a while, and you need to show up at the emergency room and make some calls. But in general, for developmental disabilities and sensory impairments, you aren't that isn't modern thinking per se. Although, just so you know, there's guardianship of the person, where they can't make any kind of personal decisions or enter into contracts. And then there's guardianship of the property, where they just can't make financial decisions. And these are different kind of legal terms that are thrown around. But you want to kind of think about how's their how do they do with money? I have plenty of individuals who will give it away to the next person, others who won't spend a penny, and others who have zero number sense at all. And so the whole concept of what to do with the money and how to pay for things and how much you need and how to anticipate and plan is absent. And so that's going to be a very big thing about what's going to be their best life moving forward. If you're not there managing the finances, who's going to do that? That actually gets tricky. Also, what's their safety concern? Are they going to, personal judgment? Are they going to, meet people on the street and bring them back to their place without even knowing who it is? How vulnerable are they to, being manipulated by others? This is something that's unfortunately become much more common, particularly for individuals on the internet. Okay. And when young people get on the internet, there's all kinds of catfishing and things that are going on constantly. So that's something that I hate to bring up, but just something that you have to, as parents, even when they're living in your home, you have to remain kind of vigilant about. Because I had one gentleman who all of a sudden started talking to a master, a spiritual master, and this is a very anxious guy who's got some developmental disabilities. But he's perfectly bright guy, has got a associate's degree from college, and the master had billed him $4 million for all the time they had talked. Okay, so these become a real issue. Fortunately, the master knew that he was kind of off balance, so when we threatened legal action, he backed off. But I've certainly had plenty of soothsayers and prostitutes and the like, take advantage of my patients just on the internet. Also, we talked about personal problem solving. Can they handle novel problems? And there's this other thought about big decisions. So if you don't have guardianship, but you're not sure that your family member can be making heavy decisions on their own, like, do I get a credit card? Do I sign on the line? Make other big decisions like that. There is something, and it's different in every state. So I wish I could give you a blanket answer. But it's called supported decision making. And some states support that, where you can legally enter into a contract as long as the individual who's going to be signing has their pre-established support crew around to give guidance, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like that's the newest thing in the world of developmental disabilities. Next. So next, the biggie is your wills. Okay. A will is a very tricky thing. I just finished redoing our wills. It's a nightmare. Okay, who's going to do what? You get to my age, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, all the people that were going to help us out 20 years ago are too old. Okay, so then you have to think of a whole new crew. So any attorney you engage really has to understand disability entitlements. This is a big deal with wills, because if your child or family member is entitled to anything like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, disability, anything like that, if the will's not done right, if something happens to you, all their entitlements will go away. Okay. And you kind of don't want that. Okay. Because the whole plan may be built on that. So you have to have a really good will, very good estate plan. And so you want to find someone who's facile and really understands the whole idea of special needs trusts, who understands the role of the trustee, particularly with someone with a variety of different kinds of impairments and isn't fully autonomous, and how they may need to rely on others who are involved with this adult to give them guidance. So the attorneys need to really understand that and that process to get a good product. I've certainly talked to a lot of people who have wills, but some of them they didn't go to someone who was really good with this, and they ended up with something that kind of really had some legal holes in it. So you do want to be careful. So talk about a special needs trust. Special needs trust is just a legal, I don't want to call it an instrument, but it's a trust where any assets, if you were to die, go into this special needs trust, which then are not counted against your family members' financial holdings, which then allows them to continue with Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, disability, these types of things. And that's very, very important. And some people say, well, I don't have any money. How am I supposed to fund a special needs trust? Well, there can be something called a springing trust. And if you have life insurance or if you have an estate upon your death, it can spring or be brought to life and funded at the time of your death. And then it goes into full force. And another interesting problem I hit was, okay, so mom and dad did this great job with the special needs trust and everything else, and grandma did her own thing and left money outright to the child, and then the child lost all their benefits. Okay. So anybody who's going to leave anything to your child needs to be aware, and that anything they leave needs to move into that special needs trust. So this is really takes some thought and some time. You really want to be very thoughtful, do, your research, find out from other parents, who have children with special needs. Just about who's an attorney who does this work in your area and who's good with it. Now, some people, if they're licensed in your state, could be elsewhere. I mean, they can be virtual, but they have to be licensed to practice law in your state because these are all very, regulated by state statute. Next. Here's the hardest one. So you get to be my age, and who's going to be the trustee? If everybody's my age, then that's actually not necessarily a good person. So you want to ask certain questions. Like, so some folks are lucky and they've got family members that would make a great trustee. Could be a sibling, a cousin, aunt and uncle. But you do have to say, do they understand and know your family member? Do they kind of get it? Because in this situation, you want the trustee to have knowledge of and kind of an understanding of, everything we talked about before, the hopes, the aspirations, the wishes, the goals. One thing I didn't talk about with the wills and the trust is one of the most important things you can do is your letter of intent. Wills are fairly limited, but it's really as the parents, your ability to kind of really spell out what this best life looks like and what your hopes are. But you want to be discussing that with the attorney as well. It's non-binding, but it really gives everybody else who then picks up the ball an idea of where you were going with this. So this can take some real time. There can also be co-trustees, that can reduce the burden, or it simply, creates a system of checks and balances. So it's not always just one person's whim, okay, depending on who the trustees are. But you don't choose a couple, you don't create a trustee couple unless you know they can play well together, okay? Otherwise, that can create a tremendous amount of difficulty, and I've certainly seen that go poorly. And then if no family members are appropriate or friends are appropriate, because it could be friends too, if they're close friends and involved with the family, there's institutional trustees. And an institutional trustee can be a great thing. I deal with a lot of them now as I've gotten older and my patients have gotten older. And you just want to be kind of, you have to, it's word of mouth. They have to, of course, be licensed in your state where you live and where your family member resides. But you have to think about what's their long-term stability. So there are organizations that don't last beyond the founder, okay? So when choosing an institutional trustee or care manager for that matter, you want to make sure that there's some long-term stability. Have they survived leadership change? Who's on their board? There are a number of questions you want to ask of what's the financial health. If you're leaving a sizable amount of money for your child, is this an institutional trust that's what we call a pooled trust? Sorry if this is all legal mumbo jumbo, meaning where your child's inheritance goes into one big pot, or is it kept separate for your child? There are a number of things you want to think about and talk about with attorneys. And I'm just leaving I just put up a few organizations that we use locally. So for instance, I said, for example, in the Mid-Atlantic here, there's an organization called By Their Side. And I put these on, not that you're going to use them, but you can kind of see how these organizations that have longevity really do business. And this is a family-founded organization that does individual as well as pooled trusts, but you don't have to do their trust with them. They'll provide case management and oversight in any number of different level of kind of cafeteria style services to the disabled adult. The ARC, which is a national organization, they do very similar things. In my area, the ARC of Virginia provides all these. There's also one in Maryland, First Maryland Disability Trust. They're very solid. Certain law firms will do it. Certain banks will do it. The main thing is there's got to be a human side. So when you look at By Their Side, the ARC, First Maryland Disability Trust, they have a requirement that if there's a trust with them, there's also a case manager assigned to that trust, so that there is not just some attorney or some administrator making financial decisions about, well, we'll pay for that or we won't pay for that. It's someone who's really taking a look at what's the life situation of the individual who we're watching over and communicating that and kind of helping to being kind of the interface between the trust and your child. So that there are certain advantages to that type of thing. Sometimes law firms work well with that, but I've had one case where, when the lawyer died, then the associates came in, but they didn't have any relationship with the child, and then that became its own problem. So that built-in case management, depending on the needs of the child, I think can be very helpful. And then can you mix family and friends and institutional? Yes, you can do anything you want, as long as the lawyers say it's okay. So you just have to kind of think about this and how it works best for you. But it takes a lot of education, really kind of figuring it out and finding experts who are good at this. And it's certainly taken me a while to kind of sort through and find who's good at it. And I've had several people offer to be kind of care managers and overseers, but then they were great human beings, but they didn't pass the what happens when they get too old test. Okay. Say they're in their 50s. Well, that may not cut it in 20 years. Okay. And so you have to think about that. Do they have a transition plan? Will this individual last as long as it needs to be as long as they need to? So there can also be friends of the trustee. So sometimes in your letter of intent, you are giving instructions, and you can even write it into the trust sometimes, who you want the trustee to be consulting with around major life decisions. Lots of ways to do this. All I can say is you educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. And don't jump with the first person. Interview a bunch of people. This is a very important kind of thing that you're putting together with the estate plan. Next.
Lance, I think I'd like to jump in for one moment.
Go
We've
ahead.
got really great questions, and I want to this expertise and your experience working with your clients really shines a light on a lot of topics. And I
Yes.
realize that there's so much here to digest. So what we want to do is pause for a minute. We've about 20 minutes left to our talk. And there's some great questions that I just want to throw out. And again, mindful, Lance, what you said, that you're not a financial expert, guide, and a lawyer, but these are topics that transition specialists and psychiatrists
Deal
and
with
people
all the
in this
time.
field, we are all immersed in this. So
Yeah.
one of the questions was, being aware of the vulnerabilities financially and safeguards that are in place. I did put a link to TrueLink, which is a Visa prepaid card, but any other suggestions or thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of times, yeah, you want to kind of provide as much as autonomy as possible for your child. But the reality is many kids uh, can't manage the money in a way that's not going to run into trouble. So there are a number of cards that that banks offer. There's a number of different kind of quote credit products, or it functions like a credit card but has a $500 limit, or it's simply a cash card and they can use that. I even have some people who operate on cash, but it gets refilled periodically and all the expenses are managed. To not do that, if your child has the ability to go out and do their own, do their own shopping, or they do enjoy making their own purchases and all that, there's got to be a way to put a ceiling on it. You have no idea. I had one kid spend $24,000 in 3 months on buying food for his friends and renting movies. Okay. That's
It's a lot of
it can
money.
it can get pretty crazy pretty fast. And so I don't, and sometimes the banks kind of give you a little pushback. Okay. But you can just search the internet, limited, controlled, safe credit card, cash card. Um, they're all on the internet, but I think that's probably the best vehicle. And then they're not having to count money. The charge is the charge. They can use the PIN and then it gets paid for, and there's no overdraft. You should never have overdraft because I have a lot of guys who can't get out of a hole because of all their overdraft fees. $35 a pop. Then they overspend 1 week and then they're, $300 down and they only get, $250 the following week. So it can snowball very quickly. So
Yeah.
that's kind of been my approach.
And I shared in the chat box for our attendees that if you want to keep a link that we've shared, there's quite a few already. You just click on those and they'll be in your browser. So when the webinar is done, Lance, someone who's seeking guardianship, if their young adult has a history of psychosis, does that make the pursuit of guardianship more difficult?
No, it might
Okay.
even make it easier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think if there's psychosis and it could recur at any time. It's not predictable, but you have to make the case to the judge and you have to have a physician sign off on it. So, you have to have a psychiatrist saying that, because of X, Y, and Z, this individual is, unable to consistently make decisions in their own best interests over time and isn't expected to, be able to do that for the foreseeable future, then the judge will typically find in favor of the family. Now, guardianship's great, but that means you have to build into your estate plan who the subsequent guardians are, et cetera. And a guardian isn't necessarily the trust, the head of the trust either. These things can all be divided depending on how you want to construct your plan.
Great. And on one more question about the special needs trust, can it be utilized for vacations? I believe it can cover almost anything except for utilities and rent, and living expenses in that regard. But I
Well,
do,
that's more of an able account. Okay. So we think of a special needs trust. It depends on the state, but you can basically use it for what you want, as far is my understanding.
yeah,
That's up to the trustee. So if, for instance, your child's dream was to go on a cruise to the Antarctic to pet penguins, and they want to go there with the aide, and the trustee says that's reasonable, and there's plenty of money, and if you don't do it now, you'll probably never do it. The trust can pay for that.
great. Thank you. All right, let's continue. Thank you.
So next, last but not least, because we're not like all my patients. I have one father, they're just like regular people. And I'm like, well, he's like, well, I'm not worried about entitlements. And I'm like, why? And I'm like, well, I already have $10 million in his account. And I was like, oh, I guess you aren't worried about entitlements, are you? So some people don't worry about it, but it's kind of funny. The few folks that I treat that don't worry about this actually don't always design as good of a plan because they're not forced to really, hone in on details. They just think they can do anything they want. So with state and federal entitlements, you have to be sure, one, is my child eligible for SSI, SSDI? Are they a disabled adult? Will they get half of my, SS, Social Security when I retire? Are they eligible for Medicaid? If um, what would make them eligible for Medicaid, and what do you have to do to keep them on Medicaid? When will they be eligible for Medicare? It could be when you go on Medicare. It could be for other reasons. There are a lot of, and so a lot of times there are people called entitlement specialists. And it depends on what your state disability agencies are like and the kind of support that you're already getting. But you can get a lot of guidance. I've sometimes even hired some of the entitlement specialists at some of the adult service organizations who are really good. And I just ask them if they'll consult with the families that I work with to really explain this system, which can be really confusing because you have to get the applications right. If they're on Medicaid, they can't have more than $2,000 in their name ever. Okay. So, but if they're on SSDI, they can work and they can lose their monthly disability check, but because of the salary they're earning, collecting shopping carts at the Giant, but they still keep their Medicare. Okay, so there are all these very important things that you have to learn about that. And then, of course, there are things like Department of Rehab Services. They'll often have a number of stuff. They've been very helpful to my daughter, but not because they provided her anything special, but they had all kinds of business grants, and she has her own business. And so they gave her a great start, kind of getting her business off the ground with some of the equipment and stuff she needed to buy. If your child has developmental disabilities, then disability agencies, sometimes the funding there can be really quite significant. And so many times that takes a lot of pressure off your personal estate. If there are some of these things, if your child only gets SSI, they're $764 a month. Then and you're expecting them to live forever, on their own. Well, sure, once you die, if they're an adult disabled child, I think they'll get 3/4 of what you used to get for Social Security, but that still may not be enough. So you kind of have to really look at the numbers, and hopefully your attorney and your financial planners can really help. So I actually test my financial planning people to kind of say, what do we have now and how much needs to go into the special needs trust to generate this much income in perpetuity? And they'll run different scenarios for you. So the point being, you get the experts to give you guidance. It takes years to figure this stuff out, okay? And we use one Social Security expert who's a great guy, but we said, so we're supposed to just do what Social Security tells us to do, even though it makes no sense and is patently absurd. And he kind of laughed and said, yeah, that's how it works. Because sometimes you're asked to do things that make no sense, but that's just how the regs work, or that's how that particular individual decided to interpret the regulations at that moment. The point being, you have to do it. Okay, so if they want that paperwork, you're going to have to get it. So once again, this is an area where it might be useful if you're not already an attorney and you don't have a ton of time, or you're not already a transition specialist. Your child's school can be extremely helpful with getting some of these things going. Okay, so a number of the schools that I consult to for developmental disabilities, they have a transition specialist that helps with the applications to Social Security, helps with the applications to the developmental disability services, things like that. So schools will have, particularly private schools, will have specialists in this area. But there are also other individuals who provide this expertise to adult service agencies around your county and your state who can also provide you, input. Next. And finally, overseers, managers, trustees, supported decision making. So who's going to be there to provide oversight? So you can put in a great plan, but the reality is someone has to make sure it's getting executed. Okay. I deal with this with group homes a lot. Okay. Where we'll put together the best behavioral intervention plan and the this and the that. Without the family there isn't anybody there necessarily to make sure whatever we put in place is going to get done. because they're running on a shoestring budget and the one-to-one support staff doesn't have necessarily the training or the time or the education. So it's like, okay, so who's going to ride shotgun? So you have to kind of think, what's that role? So you're going to do this in part through the will, through your letter of intent. And a lot of times there's these immediate loss. So, who's going to jump in to save the day if there's an acute demise? But long term, who's going to handle these responsibilities? Do you have a personal representative? Is the estate going to need to hire a case manager? Is there a family member? Sometimes you don't want to burden the sibling and involve sibling with being the trustee, but the sibling can be a co-trustee or a friend to the trustee, i.e. the institutional trustee, but also be the quality control person. It's really what I'm talking about is kind of oversight, quality control. Who's going to take your kid to the doctor and then listen to what the doctor said and make sure the recommendations get implemented? Okay. These are really important questions to ask. And so it's like, who's it going to be? If you're lucky enough to have a family member, great. Not everybody has that. And then you try and find a way, can we build this in? Now, I've got plenty of folks who don't necessarily have this. They're living in group homes. Their parents are no longer alive. And the group homes and the state, they do their best. Okay. But, we're all on a Perkins lecture. So we don't want good enough. We want the best. Okay. So if you're thinking about that and you have the capacity, there are individuals who can actually be hired by the estate just to provide oversight. And a lot of times there's social workers, case managers, things like that. Or if you decided to go with something like the ARC or By Their Side or some of these other organizations that are well established, they'll have case management built in. It's just part of what they do. It's such an important thing. So they will make sure the plan that you've developed is being executed. That's crucial. And and you kind of have to just think, is the care provider, the direct care provider, and the overseer, the quality control, are they the same person, the same agency? Are these roles split? You just kind of want to think about that and think, well, what's the best way to go? How not to burden family members, but at the same time, make sure that there's checks and balances and good quality control. So certain organizations, as I said, provide this. So, and also really important, are they going to be around for many years? Okay. If your child outlives you, you want these overseers to be kind of more, if they're not family members, institutionalized. If they are family members, not necessarily your age. Next slide. And the role of the trustee, you kind of just want to think about this. Is this person also a care overseer or actually a care provider? Okay. Because as a trustee, they hold all the purse strings. So are they all the same person? So you have to think, do I trust the trustee if they're also a care provider or a care overseer? Okay. So that's typically a family member. Okay. That's well established. But if it's institutional or you have organizations involved, a lot of times you might split that for checks and balances. Next. And then there's also, you can try and get this through adult service agencies. Sometimes you'll be able to put this plan in place and they'll do it themselves. There's the private providers, there's the nonprofits. I'm just listing these, and these are just examples. And then you can combine these state supported services with private or nonprofit organizations. So the next slide. So here's an example, okay? So this is an individual who has self-directed DDA services. Well, that's pretty nice. That's funded, but self-directed means they're either living in their own place or they're living with their family, okay? And that pays for direct support personnel, some what they call support broker and case manager oversight, but really not that much. Okay. Probably not enough. And this individual also has a special needs trust to fund housing and other life enriching needs. And then we'll also have a nonprofit provider to provide the case management through the special needs trust, as well as an institutional trustee. So see, this got split up because there wasn't family member in this particular case. So this individual has a great plan, but a self-directed developmental disabilities administration services requires a massive amount of upkeep. There's a whole HR, personnel, employee management, and everything that the recipient of the services can't manage. So there has to be someone to do it. Well, the Special Needs Trust will help fund some of this, but someone, a case manager, has to come in and do the annual budget and do budget modifications and work on hiring and firing employees and make sure and consult with the trustee about what's being done. And fortunately, it'll be case manager to case manager talking to the institutional trustees case management service. So you can see, but you could skin this cat a lot of different ways. But we're really close to time, so I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions, because there might be.
Amy asked a great question specific to Maine, and you're right, Amy. I could not find an ARC, but I put my email in the box, and I have a family support center email address for you to give you some information that might help you.
Yeah.
Thank you for these great questions, and please, we have some more time. This is a lot of information, and I always say if you can take one piece of this information that we provided through Dr. Clawson, that's a good thing. It's not really possible to integrate all of this. It's so much information.
I've been spending years on it. All I tried to do is say there are 5 categories. At some point, you're going to need to cover them all.
Right, right. Yeah. There's a question from Heather. If we're not going with a special needs trust, is there a way of still being involved in the decision-making process? I think the great thought was medical, going to doctor's appointments and being able to make sure follow-ups are integrated. And I think also, Heather, to add to that, so you can be part of information regarding diagnoses and treatment. So Dr. Clausen, what are your thoughts on that, please?
Well, there's something called health care power of attorney and your health care agent that are legal documents. So if you have a family member where you need to be involved in an ongoing way, you need to negotiate with them, because if you're not going to have guardianship of the person, you don't get to be there. Okay. But if they authorize you full access to your medical information, then you simply can participate in any way that you need to. So for instance, for my wife's brother who has developmental disabilities, he's signed off. She has healthcare power of attorney and she's his agent. And she joins when he goes to the doctor. If the nurse we've hired who takes him to his doctor's appointments isn't available, she basically is on the phone or Zooms into his doctor's appointments to kind of discuss and negotiate. So she's fully involved in any way. And also the nurse that he hires off of his budget to go with him and do the medical oversight and communicate with us has full authority. Because, he's like, that's great. These people are helping me. I'm happy to sign it. So you can.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Clausen. I think what we're going to do is continue with the slides and then being mindful of the time. And if people want to stay on for a few more moments to ask
Sure.
a couple more questions. Thank you, Dr. Clausen. Excuse
Sure.
me. So just want to let people know we have a save the date. If you are in the New England area, we do have a half-day in-person transition symposium at the Watertown campus at Perkins School for the Blind. And it's very much similar to the content of talking about very important topics regarding transition. So you're all welcome, and it's free. We also have a Facebook community. We have a transition center page, but we also have a group. And in the group, people are posting questions, sharing resources. It's a really nice hub, and it's a really great community that's building. So we welcome you to that.
It's a great idea.
Thank you. We really love the group. And it again, when you ask questions, there's so much content that people want to know about. We're really excited to talk about Pathfinder. If you've not heard of PREETS is pre-employment training services, and the Pathfinder program is a pre-employment skill building program. It's a hybrid program that works with high school students developing pre-vocational skills. And we know for a fact that when students have pre-vocational skill building and training, that they have better transition outcomes because they have more meaningful lives in society after high school. So we'd really like to talk to you more about the Pathfinder program. We'll be starting that very soon, and looking forward to hearing your questions about that. This is our team, and again, you'll be getting copies of the slides. There's also a couple of links in the chat that you might want to click on, but I did put my email address if you have any further questions. And Alexandra Lavoie did post that we have one-on-one consultations available to answer more direct, personalized questions that you might have, because you only know what you know. And these information sessions really reveal so much content of things that you need to start thinking about. So thank you so much, Dr. Clawson. Oh, one more. We do have a wonderful new program that's starting in July, and I'm really excited about this. It's a post-secondary transition program. It's residential. It will be on the Perkins campus, and we're having some information sessions to talk about that. It is a very important program for people that do not have access to transition programs in their school districts. So we'd like to share that information with you. So the link in the box for the Life Launch program is available for you to look at. And again, we have some virtual information sessions coming up that you can learn more about those. So for those that need to say goodbye, we want to thank you. If you have a few more questions you want to stay on, please feel free. And Dr. Clawson, there was a question that I'm going to throw out. Can you give examples of what a letter of intent might be and what should be
Oh,
incorporated in that?
that's interesting. I would suggest you Google it, but it's kind of the broad brushstrokes of what you would like to see happen. So here would be a letter of intent. Because I'll use this example. I would like to, if I were to die prior to my daughter, I would like her to remain in our home, okay, for approximately a 2-year period for her to adapt and adjust, but realizing that the estate probably in a practical sense can't support maintaining of an entire household just for her. At that point, it's left up to the trustee to either sell the home and find her a new place to live where she's comfortable and can continue to do her art, or maintain her as long as the trustee sees fit. So that would be an example of something that I want to see happen that would go in the letter of intent that you cannot put into a will. I would like uh, I would like her to continue her involvement with Friday night at Main Street, and want the care providers to be sure to, be on duty and have transportation set up. So that's something that she really enjoys, and continue to go to those social functions. It's kind of like the details of life that you can't put into the will. Once you've done the will, you realize there's almost no direction. There's just allocation of assets. And then it's like, well, so what's that best life look like? You put that into words.
And to add to that, and I think I'll close with that. Thank you, Dr. Clausen. Stacy posted a nice link for everyone regarding letters of intent.
Yeah, there's
Thank you
great
so much,
examples on
Stacy.
the internet. Yeah,
And,
exactly.
and and that reminds me, Stacy, we learn from each other. Thank you for sharing your resources. Thank you, all of you. Something you might want to do is to create a document for the siblings or the trustees in your life to understand who the case managers are for Social Security and contact information, when things need to be accomplished as far as dates and timelines, also passwords to access account information. So lots to talk about, but I hope you gleaned some information from this, and I want to thank you, Dr. Clausen, and our team here tonight for being together. And we will have our next session with a colleague of Lance, Molly Whalen, who
Oh, yeah, I
works with the
forgot Molly's
study.
going to be talking. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the importance of a social network and how to build a social community for your adult children. That will be November 19th, same time, 6:30. And we look forward to seeing you then. You will get an email announcement about that for a save the date.
Yeah, send me an invitation.
I shall. Thank you, Dr. Clausen.
Thank you.